Welcome to Real Bible. I'm Carol Salee, and this video is produced by the Salee Group. In each Real Bible segment, we'll strive to tackle real truth from a real book and apply it to real life. In this Christmas-themed session of Real Bible, I'm presenting 4 different segments under the same title, 4 Roads to Bethlehem. In each segment, we'll examine 4 Old Testament women who are listed in Jesus' genealogy. Thinking about genealogy makes me think about family, my children, my grandchildren, and I have to tell you something that is a part of my experience in that I have a chin dimple. And this characteristic comes from my mother's side of the family. And growing up, I was not very excited about having a chin dimple, and at least I didn't have one that was completely closed up. But what was so exciting to me was when my first daughter was born, Julie, and she was put into my arms. One of the first things I noticed about her was that she inherited my chin dimple. So when I went to have my second child, one of the first things I looked for was the chin dimple, and Jill also had the chin dimple. And then our son Joshua was born, and when he was born, he also has the chin dimple. And I'm privileged right now to be the grandmother of 5 grandchildren, and I can proudly say that 2 of the 5 inherited the chin dimple. Do you know, there's so many things that we look for whenever we have our own children, but we also spend a lot of time looking back. I mean, it's kind of a craze now to search your genealogy, and we have DNA tests that they can run and they can figure out where your family is from and maybe even find some distant relatives that you didn't even know that you have. And one of the things I believe that shows is that we want to belong and we want to be known. Well, I want you to think for a moment about your own lineage, your ancestors. And I'm going to give you a multiple choice question. You can choose one of 4 different women to have in your ancestry. Here's the first one. A woman who pretends she's a prostitute and has a child by her father-in-law. A prostitute who lies to get out of a sticky situation. An idol worshiper who is an outcast among her mother-in-law's people. And finally, a woman who commits adultery with a high-ranking official and gets pregnant. Women matching those descriptions are all in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. There they are, looking like they don't belong. We have Tamar, who pretended she was a prostitute, Rahab, who was a prostitute, Ruth, the Moabitess, who began her story as an outcast among God's people, and then Bathsheba, who had an affair with the king of Israel. Genealogies in ancient times played significant roles for the Jews. They served as a record of a family's descendants. They were used for practical and legal purposes to establish a person's heritage, their inheritance, their legitimacy, and their rights. Well, 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark and John do not provide a genealogy for Jesus. Now, we don't have time for this, but let me give you a short reason. It's because it had to do with the audience to whom they were writing and their purposes for writing. But the other 2 Gospels, Luke and Matthew, do provide a genealogy for Jesus. Now, Luke, he wrote to a more Gentile audience, and Luke wanted to show Jesus' connection to David, which establishes Jesus' right as legal heir to the throne, a link to Abraham, which links Jesus to Israel's promises from God, but also all the way back to Adam, to show that Jesus offers salvation to all people, and it's the root of faith for the Gentiles. Well, Matthew, he wrote to a primarily Jewish audience. So Matthew wrote with the purpose of trying to establish Jesus' royal Jewish bloodline. And Matthew includes some big names, some heavy hitters like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, Solomon. Well, what Matthew's intent was, he wanted to establish Jesus' claim to the Davidic throne and his messianic identity. Matthew also wanted to demonstrate that Jesus culminated God's history redeeming plan for mankind and the completion of all the Old Testament covenants and promises. And 2 in particular, the Abrahamic covenant. God had promised in Genesis chapter 12 to bless all nations through Abraham. The redemption of God's people would be accomplished by a sacrificial son or a descendant of Abraham. So the Abrahamic covenant, but also the Davidic covenant. God promised that David would have a son through whom the earth would be reclaimed and who would reign forever. Now, I know that sometimes when we get into the Bible and we look at genealogies, we just want to rush through those. Our eyes kind of roll back in our head. We don't know how to say the names. We don't understand who these people are. But Matthew and Luke decided they were going to have these genealogies. Well, this particular session of Real Bible, we're going to focus on the Matthew genealogy. And it's because of the 4 women that he included. Well, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it says, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Those few words, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, sum up the culmination of the entire Old Testament, and in them are the seeds from which the New Testament plan will grow. Because the promised Messiah must be descended from both of these key historical figures, Abraham and David, the documentation of Jesus' lineage was vital. However, to the Jewish reader, these words, this genealogy applied to Jesus of Nazareth, would have been difficult to believe, particularly when you see the inclusion of some interesting women, which was highly unusual for a Jewish genealogy. So we have to ask, why are these women included? I mean, there's a perfect reason why we say go ahead and read the genealogies, because you don't know what might be tucked away in those. Well, that's where those women's names are. So the question again, so why are these women included? Well, they continue God's path of revealing himself to mankind. The journey of these women help us discover more of what God wants us to know about him. And the journey of these women help establish Jesus' Gentileness and the truth that he came for all people. At least 3 of these women are Gentiles, considered unclean by the Jewish standards of the Old Testament. Tamar and Rahab were Canaanites, Ruth was a Moabite, and Bathsheba was married to a Gentile, a Hittite. Well, 3 of these women were involved in what could be deemed illicit sexual relationships. Here's a quote from an author, an unknown author. There is no pattern of righteousness in Jesus' lineage. Jesus' descendants were humans with all of the weaknesses, yet potentials of everyday people. But God worked through people such as these in a purposeful way to bring about his plan of salvation. And if I could sum up the woman that we're going to look at today, her story in just like a little catchphrase, it would be this: God writes straight and crooked lines. And I think you'll see what I mean by the time we get to the end of her story. Her story takes place in Scripture in Genesis chapter 38. And I'm going to call her Tamar, and I'm also going to call her an outsider. She's Tamar, the outsider. Tamar is a woman who was unfairly treated, she was overlooked, and she was often put upon. And she also represents the woman who seeks to be included in God's plan even when the odds are stacked against her. So just to give a little bit of history, we don't have time for all kinds of genealogies and charts like I've done in some of my other studies, but let me just give you this. We have Abraham and Isaac, his son, and Isaac had a son named Jacob, and then Jacob went on to have 12 sons. Now, there were 4 women involved in him coming to having that many sons, but I want us to narrow the focus into Jacob and his first wife, Leah. Between them, they had 6 sons, and their 4th son, his name was Judah. And Judah is the tribe through which Jesus came. So he's a very, very significant person in Scripture. And we haven't seen a lot from Judah up until this time, but in Genesis chapter 38, we see kind of what Judah is made of. And so when we lay down Judah and Tamar together, we really do get this sense that God can include all kinds of people in his plans and his purposes. So Judah, he had a son named and he had marry Tamar, who was a Canaanite woman. Well, we don't know what did, but he was so wicked that he was put to death by God. Now, Levitical law at that time required the next of kin must marry his widow. Well, what this law did was it allowed a man to inherit his dead brother's property and manage it for the dead brother's widow. So it kept the family property intact. And as part of the arrangement, the man would marry his brother's widow, and then any children they had would be counted as the sons of her dead husband. So what it becomes, if I can just make it a little more narrow for us, is it becomes a birthright issue. So as the oldest, was entitled to the birthright. He was going to get the biggest inheritance. But if he has no offspring, it would pass to Onan. If, however, Tamar bears a son that is considered Er's, then the birthright will pass to that son. So that's a lot of ways of looking at something that we don't necessarily understand. So I tried to just give you a brief version of that because it's critical that we know this to Tamar's story. So the next brother, Onan, he took Tamar and he married Tamar. Well, Onan, I'm going to do this as delicately as possible. He failed to fulfill his responsibility to his brother's memory. Since his offspring with Tamar would not be considered his own, so Onan's offspring with Tamar would not be considered his own. They would be considered the dead brother Er's. He spilled his semen onto the ground. And for this, God put him to death. So Onan, it's like he took Tamar for sexual pleasure, but he had no intention of giving her offspring. Well, Onan's actions have to do with rightful inheritance. He was refusing Tamar's right to become pregnant, because Onan knew that while he would have to support the child, he would not receive any of his deceased brother's estate, since it would legally belong to and Tamar. Isn't it confusing to keep all this straight? Well, there's one other brother in the picture. His name is Shelah. Well, Judah is afraid for his son Shelah that he'll die too if he marries Tamar, because women who were prone to becoming widows at this time were suspected of witchcraft. Well, Judah, he asked Tamar to live in her own father's house until Shelah is older, but he actually has no intention of allowing the marriage. So in a sense, Judah is sentencing Tamar to a life of widowhood and barrenness with no option to leave the family and marry elsewhere. So Judah and Tamar, they become the next focus in the story. Tamar figured that if the son, Shelah, wouldn't marry her and give her an heir, then the dad could. It is possible that her culture regarded her act as legally justified, because Canaanite law stated that should the brother of the deceased man also perish and so be unable to fulfill his duty to the widow, she should marry her late husband's father. Now, I know that has a huge kind of an E factor for us, but we have to understand that the story is just told. It's not told with any sense of condemnation or criticism of Tamar. It's just presented. However, by Leviticus chapter 18, this particular practice will be prohibited. Well, Judah, he's grieving the loss of his own wife, and he went to visit a friend. And Tamar knew the road that Judah would travel. So Tamar, she disguised herself as a shrine prostitute, and she sat in an open place along the way where Judah would travel. The profession of temple prostitute was considered respectable to the candidates. And cult prostitution was a way of promoting fertility of the land and animals. The prostitutes would service the men prior to their planting of fields or mating of their animals. So not knowing Tamar's true identity, Judah sees this prostitute, not knowing it's his daughter-in-law, bargains for her favors, and then secures them with the guarantee of a payment of a goat. He just doesn't have the goat with him at this time. So Tamar, still disguised as the temple prostitute, she requested a pledge of some kind that she could hold on to until the goat arrived. Well, Judah gave Tamar his seal, his cord, and the staff in his hands. These were symbols of his identity. It would be like giving her your driver's license today and something else that belonged to you. Well, Tamar, she accepted these items as a guarantee of payment, but with them she held undeniable evidence of Judah's identity. Judah has his time with this temple prostitute, goes on his way, comes back to pay the prostitute. He can't find her, and no one even knows who he's talking about. Tamar becomes pregnant. Well, when Judah heard that Tamar was pregnant, he was determined to have her put to death. Tamar sent Judah back his personal items and lets him know that she was pregnant by the man who owned those items. And Judah realizes in this chapter in Genesis that Tamar was more righteous than him, because Judah was the one who wouldn't honor the law by allowing her to marry his third son. So let's really get this. The focus on the story is not the prostitution. It's descendants. Judah's actions undercut God's promise that Jacob would become a great nation. Abraham had received the promise. Isaac had received the promise. Jacob had received the promise. And now Judah, as the head of his own family, had certain obligations to ensure the well-being of everyone in his family. In failing to meet his obligation, Judah recognized his own unrighteousness. Now, Judah and Tamar, they do not marry. But Tamar gave birth to twins who would be Judah's tribal representatives. The younger twin, Perez, found a place in the greatest of all genealogies. You will find his mother's name, Tamar, and you will find Perez's name in Matthew chapter 1. Here's another quote. God's sovereignty and blessing can be found in what appear to be the most disastrous of circumstances. This does not mean that God approves of our behavior or that he enjoys bringing disaster into our lives. It is simply a testimony of his ability to bring good out of evil. The depth of God's sovereignty is demonstrated by the fact that there is no choice we can make that can interfere with his plan. Because remember, God writes straight and crooked lines. So what does Tamar's road teach us? If God can accept women like her and incorporate them into his plan of salvation, then there's hope for all of us. You see, Tamar is for women who wonder where God is when one tragedy after another comes. Tamar is for women in tough situations who wonder if God cares, if anybody cares. Tamar is for women who can't imagine anything great could ever come from their mess. She's for women who need real love and true redemption. And Tamar is for women who need to remember God's unseen hand is moving behind the scenes. You know, the angel said to Mary, and she's also listed in Matthew chapter 1, the angel said to Mary in Luke 1:37, nothing is impossible with God. God has a plan for our lives because of a baby born in Bethlehem. God can use any one of us to fulfill his purposes because of a baby born in Bethlehem. I don't know if you know this, but the name of the city where Jesus was born, Bethlehem, means house of bread. And we all come to Bethlehem as beggars for that bread. And I'm going to close with this from another unknown author. It's just a quote that I've had in my notes for years, but it really sets us up for this study today and for the remainder of the studies. Some of us come to Bethlehem, to Jesus, as little children. Others, like the man crucified alongside Jesus, come to Christ at what seemed to be the last possible moment. Some come naturally, like a child running into his open arms. Others turn to him only after great heartache and crisis. Some came from environments where we were loved and respected. Others come to Jesus as wounded, broken individuals who never knew a loving word or a tender touch. Some lived lives of great sin, and others lived in a way that would almost make you think they didn't need him. Yet we all took a road to Bethlehem in different ways, at different times, and from different backgrounds. But we arrived. If that's not your story this Christmas, that you arrived, I pray you'll find that road. Because you see, it's not that far to Bethlehem.